So we have our login handler written, and it's at the point where we can actually try connecting our front end to the back end for the very first time. Now it's not complete, obviously. Here in handlers.go in the back end, down here on line 43 in my code, we're not actually doing authentication, but we are going to send back some JSON. And all I want to do at this point is make sure I can connect my front end to my back end. So I'm going to open my terminal window in my API backend, make sure I'm at the root level of the project. I am, and I'll run it. Go run ./cmd/API. And that should start it listening on port 8081. And it appears to have done so. Perfect. So now let's switch back over to our front end and look at the component login.view, which of course is in the components folder inside the src folder. And I'll scroll down to the submit handler method. And all it's doing right now is writing to the console. But we're at the point now where we can actually call the API, call the backend. Now to make that happen, we need to send some information. So I'll declare a constant, and I'll call it payload because it's what I'm sending to the backend. And it's going to be just a JavaScript object. And I'll populate it with the two things we expect to find. And if you recall, over here in the handler, we're expecting to find in JSON email and password right here in the credentials type. So let's go back to our front end and give it an email. And how do I get email from this view component? Well, I already have the data, which returns email and password. And we use the vModel directive to bind whatever's in the form to that data. So I can just say this.email. And the same thing with password. Password is this.password. Okay, so there's our payload. But of course, that's a JavaScript object. And I need to convert it to JSON. And I need to tell JavaScript, the fetch command we'll be using momentarily, that we're making a post request. So let's create another constant called request options. And this will be passed to fetch. And again, it's just a JavaScript object. So the first thing we tell it is we're going to use the method post. Okay? And then we give it a body. And the body is just that payload converted to JSON. And we can do that in JavaScript just by saying JSON.stringify. And we're going to stringify payload. So now we have the payload. We've used the payload and request options. It's time to make our fetch request. And in JavaScript, that's really easy. We fetch to a particular URL. And in our case, it's http://localhost on port 8081, which is the one we're listening to. And the root we want is right out of our roots file in the back end, users login. And we give it its second parameter, request options, right there. So that makes the call. Then, after we make the call, we get our response, which has to be in parentheses, I believe. And we convert it to response.json, built right into JavaScript. Then, after that's done, we have our data object. I'll use my arrow function, and I'll use curly brackets, and I'll check to see if there was an error. And if you recall, back over here in our back end, when we send that response back, we're actually giving it the field error in our response payload, which is false if there's no error and true if there is an error. And of course, that comes from this type up here, JSON response. In JSON, it's called error lowercase, and we get a message also in lowercase. So let's go back to our front end, and we'll just do an if statement. If data.error, something went wrong. Else, everything worked. So if something went wrong, what do I want to do? Well, I'll just console.log for now. I just want to make sure this can talk to the back end. Console.log, and I'll just say error. And then data.message. Otherwise, everything worked. And again, right now I'm just going to say console.log, and I'll just log data. And that should be sufficient for our purposes. So if everything works according to plan, and it won't, but don't worry about that, if everything works according to plan, I should be able to open my terminal and run npm run serve. And go to my browser and reload just to make sure everything is current. I'll go to the login screen and I'll open my JavaScript console so I can see what's going on. And I'll try logging in. me@here.com, and the password is just password. Let's log in. and we're going to get an error. But don't worry about that. We'll take care of that in the next lecture. Let's try it out. And we get the response. And this is a security feature that we have to take into account. And it's related to something called CORS, C-O-R-S. And you read the error message, it tells you exactly what's going on. So we did call submit handler properly. We got that success message printed. And then we have this error, cross-origin request blocked. The same origin policy disallows reading the remote resource at, and then it gives our URL. And then it tells me the reason, CORS header access control allow origin is missing. So it's doing exactly what it should. And this is a good thing. You don't want to leave your API open to the entire world necessarily. There are situations where you want to do that for a public API. But in our case, we want to make sure that this works only when and where it's supposed to. So we're going to have to make a change to our routes file on our back end and try again. And we'll do that in the next lecture.